My topic today is what does S3 bring to sociocracy? And to start that, I want to give a brief overview what I mean by sociocracy. And we distinguish between sociocracy as a concept, a mindset where people affected by decisions can influence those decisions on the basis of reasons to do so, and the sociocratic circle method, what we abbreviate as SCM. This is a method for governing an organization developed by Gerard Entenburg and taught by the Sociocracy group. So whenever I say sociocracy, I speak about the mindset. This is why I usually have a lowercase s, and I will refer to the circle method specifically by talking about SCM. And I will talk a bit about Agile, and Agile is also more or less a mindset for solving complex problems in self-organized teams with a value-driven and iterative approach. And what we call Sociocracy 3.0, what is it? It's a collection of tools for effective collaboration at any scale. You could see it as a practical guide for evolving organizations that are more agile and more resilient. Or you can say it's a path for developing an agile and sociocratic mindset. What it does is it brings you an extensive collection of guidelines and practices, what we call patterns, that have been proven helpful for organizations for improving performance, alignment, fulfillment, and well-being. And S3 helps you discover how to best reach your objectives and navigate complexity in your organization, one step at a time, without the need for a radical reorganization or a big change initiative. You just start where your greatest need is and select one or more patterns to try, and you move at your own pace and develop skills as you go. So you don't need a big training up front. And regardless of where you stand in an organization, you will find a pattern that helps you on your way forward at any given moment. Let me tell you a story how I discovered sociocracy and how we found what Sociocracy 3.0 is. About 4 years ago, I discovered the Sociocratic circle method. My background then, I was in agile software development, as a coach, as a CTO, as a developer. And what I knew is how to solve complex problems in self-organized teams. But what always got into my way was things like management, leadership, bureaucracy, the organization basically. And Agile and also Lean had no real answers to these challenges of organizations. You could almost say they avoided the topic because it's a controversial topic and it often challenges people's core belief. So they best let it alone. And I discovered sociocracy through a friend and a colleague. And when I first saw it, I was amazed. It was in SCM, there were lots of great ideas. It seemed like the missing piece, the solution to a lot of problems. But it was a pretty obscure method. Nobody heard it. I totally embraced it. I used it in my projects. I held workshops to teach people about it. I gave talks on conferences. And people ask me all the time, that's really great, but why haven't I heard of it? It's 40 years old. And I said, well, that's basically because it's from the Netherlands and there's no good free materials in English. So I'll make some. And I created a simple website with only text and a few images. And I explained SCM, as I saw it back then, as a collection of patterns. So just break it down into small pieces. I found back then around 30 pieces that I described. So people could just use one of the pieces and not having to implement the whole method. And I showed this to James Priest, and he had a lot to say about that. But he somehow liked the idea of getting together and creating free materials for sociocracy. So this is what we did. And we created a YouTube video, an introduction to SCM. And while we were working on that, we discovered a lot of things we got into arguments about. And through a process of questioning everything and through observing how we went about dissecting sociocracy, we eventually arrived at what S3 is today. And it's not a method. Because methods, they sound really good on paper, but they usually fail in the complexity of real life. They create resistance because why should people change their mind just on a promise that this is going to be good? And if you look back at revolutions in the course of history, we find that they break a lot of stuff that's actually working, and people are still stuck with the same old mindset they had before the revolution. So we thought we need a way to respect the culture of an organization and the experience of individuals. And this is why we built S3 from patterns. A pattern is a very small change that brings value to an organization by solving a very specific problem. Our goal was that everyone should find a pattern that helps them in their specific situation, even the people who wear a suit. And those patterns, experimenting with those patterns, should help people create that new mindset at their own pace while they solve their problems. And all these patterns we have, they are very simple and very lightweight. You can see these patterns are grouped in 10 different groups, and we have around 70 of them. So this is the whole map. And if you go to the S3 website, you will find that map and a description for each of those patterns. What we also thought would be a good idea is having a new model of distribution. S3 is totally free. All the resources we create are available under a Creative Commons license. And not only the resources, but also the source files and the software we create to build them. So we use tools by others, of course, and some of them cost money, but everything we build ourselves, we also make free. So people can just dive in and use these resources and create something new out of it. So it's not a fixed thing, it's not stuck. If you think something needs to change, and for some reason you can't convince us to change it, you can just do it yourself. And S3 is also open and decentralized. It's not brought into organizations by management or leaders alone. Everyone in the organization can just pull in a pattern in their area of responsibility and just experiment with it. And we encourage adaptation and evolution, so people should change it if they think it doesn't fit. And we have a very simple language that helps people discuss organizations, and we have also a glossary that explains what each term means. So people can just take it and play with it and experiment with it. Another distinction from SCM is that we do not talk about aims or purpose anymore. We talk about drivers. Because we found that it's really, really necessary, if you want to collaborate, that everyone involved understands the why we're doing something. And if you look at the aims or objectives or visions, you often put the cart before the horse. You have a goal, but you still don't understand why you need to get there. So we help people develop a shared understanding of the why through a driver, which is basically the organization's motive to respond to a specific situation. And we encourage people to look at the current situation, the effect of this situation on the organization, the need of the organization in relation to the situation, and the impact of attending to that need. Constantly evolving their understanding of that driver as they respond to it. This is the loop you can see, the experiment, evaluate, evolve around the driver. Also, S3 is a holistic approach. Success of an organization is 95% work and 5% governance. And also life is one indivisible whole thing. You cannot act differently in one part of your life and in another way in another part of life. This leads to a kind of cognitive dissonance. And that's the same in an organization. So work and governance need to be organized according to the same principles. So we bring a consistent mindset to all aspects of collaboration. So you can see we have patterns for co-creation and evolution, for peer development, for building organization, for bringing in S3 into organization, for defining agreements, for focused interactions, meeting practices, organizing work, and organizational structure. So there's a really broad variety of patterns. And we have S3 integrated with Agile and Lean thinking. There's a lot of Lean methods and tools out there, and S3 plays nice with all of them. So it's not an empty method. It embraces the idea of self-organization and complexity theory. And you can even use S3 to implement other agile methods in your organization. It has patterns for that. And we have new ways to evolve organizational structure. Both SCM and Holacracy, they still embrace hierarchy and leaders. But self-organization doesn't need leaders. It benefits from distributed leadership, but this is something entirely different. And hierarchy, they often fail in complex situations. The bigger an organization gets, the more people you have, the more limiting is hierarchy when it comes to information. If you look at this illustration here, you can see how in the upper illustration, how information has to travel all over the hierarchy. And in the lower one, you can see information traveling along the path where the value flows through the organization. The green boxes, they represent the value. So it's much more effective to communicate along those paths for some organizations. And this is in conflict to a hierarchy. We also learned in software development, the organizational structure you have determines the architecture of the software we can build. And we found that a hierarchical software architecture does not scale well. It's a really bad idea to have this in a large system. So S3 brings you patterns for evolving an organization's and structure in ways that go beyond hierarchy. And what we did to achieve that is that we have several small building blocks, several small patterns for creating structure, and then patterns that allow you to create bigger structures. And as you combine those and experiment with them, you can find the structure that your organization needs. And it doesn't have to be a hierarchy at all. It can be several overlapping hierarchies, a heterarchy, whatever you need, you can use these patterns and discover that. So to recap all of this, S3 is free. All you need is just an open mind to unlearn a few things you think are true in organizations. It's open, you can just take it and do whatever you want with it. It's accessible because it's simple enough so everyone can just take it and play with it. And it's small enough so it doesn't pose a risk to an organization. Both as a perceived risk, so people say this is too big, let's not do this, and also a real risk because it's just a small change and a small experiment. You can easily adapt it. We even have a pattern that tells you how to adapt patterns. It's value-based because we have these 7 principles that are underlying under all these patterns. And it's opinionated and not an empty method. It's built on self-organization, complexity thinking, and a decentralized mindset. And I think it's a pretty strong brand. It has a simple logo, it has compelling visuals, and it has a certain sense of style that is not present everywhere. If you're curious, we have a website, we have lots of free materials, and I have a blog where I occasionally write something. Yeah. So I guess it's time for questions. I'm just trying to figure out how to see the chat. Just a second.
It's at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, I somehow managed to get into another screen that is really tiny. Can you help me out? Are there any questions in the chat? Do you see them? Ah, I got it. Ah, okay. How does leadership work in S3? Well, however you want. You can elect somebody into a role as a leader if you want, or people can just take leadership in a situation. It entirely depends on how you lay out your organization and how you distribute work. All is possible. Does that capture it, or do you want to hear more about it?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I see the role of a leader in sociocracy, that a leader also makes sure that commitments are held. How do you go about in S3? Keeping control, being in direct, and also knowing that I have this kind of role and I'm elected for it. To make sure that commitments are held. For this, I need a real clear role, otherwise I would not take it. And the question is, how do you go about that in S3?
Well, you can do all of those things. You can have a role, you can define a role for a leader. That's one way of going about it. In self-organized teams, you usually don't have a leader. You have the collective reminding each other about commitments that have to be held. So you can also do that. In my experience, it's a good idea if everyone who has to contribute to a commitment is aware of that commitment and takes that commitment serious. So the role of a leader in self-organizing teams, it's more a role of a coach, and you can also have that in S3. We have patterns for creating roles and patterns for evolving people's performance in a role together. So you can deal with leadership however you think is a good idea at the moment. You can experiment with that and develop the kind of leadership that you need in your situation. And you may start out with a leader as a role, and you may end up with self-organizing units that take the responsibility for distributed leadership.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. There's, how can I learn more? There are workshops to learn with other workshops to learn with others, not just reading. Yes. Occasionally I do workshops, but most of the work I do is in-house in organizations. And James and Lily, they do tons of workshops where they teach sociocracy to people in a 3-day course where people can actually experience these patterns and try them out themselves and learn and see how it feels to practice Sociocracy 3.0. Do I see S3 as an evolution from SCM? Is it an addition, or are there potential conflicts with SCM? Well, I do see it as an evolution because it is building on SCM, and it also integrates lots of other things. So I see it as a next steps. We have everything in it that makes SCM great. So this is why we call it Sociocracy 3.0, because we want to respect this lineage of SCM. And I wouldn't say that there's any conflicts. If you will, SCM is S3. It's just a very specific interpretation of S3. All the patterns are in there, so you can build S3 out of you can build SCM out of S3. I don't see any conflict here. So next question: how do you contrast S3 with TEALS? I don't. I never got my head around TEAL. I'm not totally keen on it. I can't answer that, sorry. I read the book, but it didn't speak much to me. Maybe if you have a more specific question, I could answer it, but could you give me a more specific question about TEAL, or is that enough of an answer?
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Somebody said S3 is a tool to reach the TEAL mindset. That's probably it. There's another question. How do you go about coordinating teams so that they do not do the same work in two teams? Yeah, how would you do that? What we have is the concept of a domain, the area of work and responsibility of people in an organization. And so we encourage people to clarify what their domains are. And sometimes domains do overlap. And if we discover that, we need to just adjust the domain description. So the domain description, the documentation of what is my job and what is yours, making structure explicit in a logbook. This is the tool we use to evolve these overlaps. But I think that's not so different from how SCM would do it, or Holacracy. I mean, that happens because people don't communicate, and you have to resolve it once you discover it by documenting it, making an agreement.
I have a little question in addition to that.
Mm-hmm.
And this is about your description of domains. We have been talking about this earlier. Whether you in S3 accept that you have all overlapping domains, because in the other things, SCM and Holacracy, people are very careful to keep domains not overlapping.
Yes. These overlaps, they happen. If you have two teams and one team produces something and hands it over to the next team, there is an overlap in their domain. Those domains are connected. You cannot differentiate them really clearly. And I think that is okay. You just have to work around that. Both of them, they take responsibility for moving the same piece of work forward. And so there is a bit of overlap. Also, if you delegate a domain to somebody else, or a part of your domain to somebody else, you still retain overall accountability for that domain. If the other person is not successful in accounting for the delegated part, you're still stuck with it. So it's a good idea to be clear what the boundaries of a domain are, but it's also a good idea to acknowledge that it is not always possible to make that distinction, and then you need to establish channels of communication so that this overlap doesn't lead to unnecessary work.
Thank you.
There's a question where I say setting up a delegate circle between parallel domains. That would be one way of dealing with overlaps. Yeah, that would be one way of doing it. Also, you could just double link two circles with each other. And then the domains, when you have an overlapping domain, it depends on the situation. We have a few patterns that can be applied, and you should start with the simplest one. This is my recommendation for everything. Do the simplest thing that has a chance of working, and if that doesn't work, take the next more complex one. Okay, I see a message that we got 2 more minutes. Any thoughts on extending S3 with facilitation tricks, practices that help building empathy and finding a common rhythm? I mean, not focusing only on the rational side of an issue, but also the building feelings which are aligned. Yeah, by all means. Anything you can bring as facilitation, or tools like NVC or the core protocols is very, very helpful. I mean, in Agile, people using a lot of those tools to work with emotions and bring them on the table, that's always helpful. This is really, really necessary. Otherwise, if you don't bring a group together, if you don't find a common rhythm, if you don't embrace your feelings and work with them, there's no chance of being successful.